Yesterday we began looking at the subject of Christ, our example. And we began by looking at a passage from 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 21 through 24. And as we pick up our study today, I would like to go back and to remind you of the words of that passage once again. Here Peter writes, "For you have been called for this purpose, since Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example for you to follow in his steps, who committed no sin, nor was any deceit found in his mouth. And while being reviled, he did not revile in return. While suffering, he uttered no threats, but kept entrusting himself to him who judges righteously. And he himself bore our sins in his body on the cross, so that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. For by his wounds you were healed." Yesterday we looked at Jesus being an example of suffering, and also Jesus being an example of sinlessness. And while Jesus certainly endured suffering, he kept entrusting himself to him who judges righteously, as we saw in verse 23. When his enemies reviled him, he did not respond in kind. Isaiah, prophesying of Jesus' suffering, said he was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth, like a lamb that is led to slaughter, and like a sheep that is silent before its shearers. So he did not open his mouth, Isaiah 53, verse 7. He came to do the Father's will, John 6:38, and he relied upon the Father for help in carrying out his work, as we read in Luke 22, verses 42 and 43. Friends, we have been called to do the will of God. Jesus said that the one who does the will of my Father will enter the kingdom of heaven, Matthew 7:21. And as we strive to do his will, we must trust in the Lord with all our heart and not lean on our own understanding, Proverbs 3:5. And as we face suffering in this life, let us trust in God and the hope that he offers. Paul described his attitude when he despaired even of life. Indeed, we had the sentence of death within ourselves, so that we would not trust in ourselves, but in God who raises the dead, 2 Corinthians 1, verses 8 and 9. And as we face difficulties and circumstances beyond our control, we need to recognize that our dependence is upon God, and we need to rely upon him. But also we see that Jesus bore our sins in his body on the cross, 1 Peter 2:24. And as we already noticed, Jesus did not go to the cross on account of his own sins, 1 Peter 2:22. Simply put, he died for our sins. Friends, that does not mean that our sins literally became Jesus' sins. What that means is that Jesus took the guilt of our sins. He paid the price for what we had done. Paid the price for our sins, and that while we were yet sinners, Jesus' love was so much for us that he died for us. Peter later explained in this same epistle in 1 Peter 3 and verse 18, "For Christ also died for sins once for all, the just for the unjust. He freely gave his life as a sacrifice for us." And as Paul explained in his letter to the saints at Rome, Jesus died for us while we were helpless, while we were sinners, and while we were the enemies of God. But because of his willingness to sacrifice himself for us, we must be willing to sacrifice our lives for him. Paul told the Romans, "Therefore I urge you, brethren, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies a living and holy sacrifice, acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service." Romans 12 and verse 1. Friends, we should be able to echo the words of the Apostle Paul, where he says, "I have been crucified with Christ, and it is no longer I who live, but Christ liveth in me, and the life that I now live, I live in the flesh. I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me," Galatians 2 and verse 20. John pointed out that this also means that we should be willing to sacrifice for our brethren. He said, "We know love by this, that he laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for the brethren," 1 John 3 and verse 16. We need to put the Lord and others ahead of our own personal interests and be willing to make sacrifices. Friends, we need to understand that Jesus is the Good Shepherd. He is our guide. He is our guardian. And we need to submit our lives to Him and follow His perfect example. Friends, we want to thank you for joining us for our program today, and have a blessed day.